Thanks, Erika, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Roberto Dilla. I'm the academic head for the School of Science and Technology here in Microsec University, and it is really a pleasure to welcome all of you to this Emerging Leader Series session, Staying Cyber Safe as Cities Get Smarter. So I think this is a truly exciting and very relevant topic, and we have two very special speakers with us today, Ms. Shazina Zaini and Dr. Steve Kerrison, who will be exploring the cybersecurity risks that the public, businesses, and government face as smart technology becomes increasingly widespread. Ms. Shazina has a very unique background, I have to say. She started with a degree in law from the University of Western Australia, but then successfully moved into IT with a degree from Murdoch University, and is a very successful professional now. She is an experienced network programmer, and she's working as senior developer at Microsec, a local company whose mission is to build next-gen IoT solutions with enterprise-grade security. And Dr. Steve Kerrison is a senior lecturer here at Microsec University, Singapore. He specializes in cybersecurity, and in fact, he is the person overseeing several subjects for our new Bachelor of Cybersecurity degree. He is also an expert in embedded system, microprocessor architecture, IoT cybersecurity, and many other technological areas. And he's not only an academic, and he has an extensive and varied professional background. He's worked as a technology journalist, as a sysadmin, research scientist, and was also the CTO at Microsec in the past. So before giving the word to our speakers, just one note, please be aware that the session is being recorded, and also questions can be posted in the Q&A platform that we have, and that will be answered at the end of the session. So that's all from me for now. So please, Steve and Shazina, up to you, and let's hear what you have to say.
Great. Thanks very much for the introduction, Roberto. Hello, everyone. As Roberto said, I'm Steve Kerrison. Just let me make sure my screen share is working. I think it looks good. Okay, so yes, today's talk. It's about the sort of things that keep me up at night, basically. So let's have a little look at, well, first, who we are and what we're going to try and discuss with you today, and hopefully, at the very least, give you some food for thought about what research could be done in the future, and maybe even start some conversations, hopefully with us involved, about what research we could do together to improve the state of the art when it comes to keeping nations, cities, and the people within them safe. So yeah, we're going to start with about the presenters before we start looking at challenges and the interests and opportunities that we face. So first, it will be me. As I say, I'm Steve Kerrison. I'm right now a senior lecturer in cybersecurity at JCU here in Singapore. Previously to that, I was in fact CTO at Microsec, with whom Shazina works right now. And prior to that, I was a research scientist at A-Star in the model factory at ARTC. That's also here in Singapore, as you might well know. Their mission is to improve manufacturing technologies for Industry 4.0. The group I was in focused on Internet of Things, industrial Internet of Things, and so on. So cybersecurity was a big concern there. Prior to that, I was a research and teaching associate at the University of Bristol in the UK. That's where I did my PhD. That's where I then did my research and was also lecturing there in computer science related topics. I've been working extensively on the Bachelor of Cybersecurity program that we have here at JCU Singapore. And when I'm not kept busy with that, I'm also looking at cybersecurity and IoT related research. So I'll pass over now to Shazina for her to introduce herself.
Hello, I'm Shazina. I'm a senior software developer with Microsec, and Steve used to order me around while he was CTO at Microsec, and I specialize in network programming and backend development, mostly in Python. And what Microsec does is very much in tune with the topic of today's seminar. We do cybersecurity solutions for the Internet of Things, and we've noticed several challenges in our work, which I'll briefly mention because they will form the basis of much of the discussion in this webinar. We've noticed that we work mostly with small devices, and these come with lots of constraints. And these small devices communicate using lots of different methods, not traditionally used on the internet as we know it. And because these devices are out in the field, they're very easy to physically get to. And this makes the room for attack surface much greater than would have been in the past. In the past, these things would have been kept away behind lock and key. And on to the next slide, Steve will mention.
Okie doke. Thanks, Shaz. Yeah, so the way we're going to do this presentation, we're going to kind of weave the conversation between myself and Shaz. There's not a distinct change in slide content or anything. We thought we'd kind of meld it together. So yeah, that's who we are. Let's have a look now at, from our perspectives, maybe in a bit more detail at what the challenges we face are. And maybe you're wondering, you know, what even is a smart city? So let's try our best to answer that question. So like I said earlier, get kept up at night by worrying about these things. So yeah, let me ask the question to you that I ask myself every day. What could possibly go wrong? In this case, inside a smart city. So I'm going to show you a few things now that we need in a smart city in order for it to function, or benefits that might come about from having a smart city concept. So let's just get in our heads some of these ideas and concepts now. The first is transport. Right? The smarter our transportation systems are, the more efficient they can be. That can be anything from mass rapid transport to improving the way we do monitoring for traffic lights. It can even include autonomous vehicles, electric vehicle charging. All of these elements, when combined, can give us a better city life if done properly. Energy. Of course, I just mentioned electric vehicle charging there. We've got to get the energy to those vehicles somehow, and everything else that consumes electricity within our city. If the power goes out, we've got a big problem. So that's another element of a smart city that we need to protect. Other utilities as well, aside from energy, things like waste disposal, recycling, water, etc. The more people depend on it in a dense environment, the smarter it benefits from being, and the more at risk it is of failure as well. Healthcare is another obvious one. I'm going to talk about that specifically a little bit later, but I'm sure we can understand, especially in a city like Singapore, the importance of having a good, agile healthcare system that can deal with the needs of a dense and aging population. The connectivity itself is really important in a smart city. Anything we do that is smart has to be somehow connected. If you've heard of this thing called the Internet of Things, the basic idea is any device, maybe not a computer, something that we're not so familiar with, not so obviously a computer, that connects to the internet somehow to do something useful between the digital and physical world, usually. And we'll see a few more examples of those later. All of these things generate data, and we make decisions based on that data. So the data itself is very important, where we store it, how we protect it, how we use it. The things, right? I've mentioned the connectivity, I've mentioned what the things are. They themselves are something that need protecting. And as Shaz said earlier, they are something that can sometimes be easy to get at because they're everywhere around us in the world. So there's a potential security risk when that is the case. Our supply chains. I wanted to mention this because I think these days in our COVID afflicted world, we're acutely aware of the impact that any perturbation in our supply chain has, from shipping to certain items of food being in short supply for a while, right? I think we're acutely aware of that already. And finance is another area I want to talk about. I don't think that's specific to smart cities necessarily, but smart cities do heavily leverage a lot of digital banking and other online features, using various devices for payment and so on. So I think that's definitely worth talking about. And if that's a list of things you can get in your head to think, well, what can go wrong with all of those things? Here are, I think I've got 3 examples for you. Example 1, what happens when a company that's providing an oil pipeline has their systems hacked to the extent that the machines that control essentially where the oil goes can't do that anymore, and they have to shut down their pipeline? Well, what happens is people find out about that. They get worried that the gas stations or the petrol stations are going to run out of petrol to pump. And so to avoid running out of petrol, everybody rushes to go and get some. And then they run out of petrol. So yeah, this happens. In fact, it happened last year in June in the US. I'm sure many of you will be aware of it. So the attack itself might not necessarily have been intended to disrupt an oil pipeline. It might have just been to target a company who would want to pay to get the problem fixed. This using something that we're quite aware of now, most of us, ransomware, where an attacker will basically lock out one or more machines and force a company, extort money out of them to unlock it. But the consequences of being locked out of a system is that you can't do anything with it. And if that system's in control of some important infrastructure, like an oil pipeline, then we've got a problem, and things kind of snowball from there. Shaz, you want to add something on there? Nope. Okay. Let's do some more ransoming. In the healthcare space, this happened about 5 years ago in the UK. Ransomware affected a whole host of machines in the National Health Service inside the United Kingdom. This brought their IT systems to a complete standstill for several days. It meant that hospitals and GP surgeries across both England and Scotland had to do everything manually, and that meant everything was very, very slow. This was bad for the efficiency and the care given by the National Health Service at the time. They were using already very out-of-date computers. And yeah, the press did not take kindly to that, nor did the public once all of this came out. But of course, prior to that, it was business as usual right up until things went wrong. And if we look more locally and more recently at things that have gone on, I've attempted some alliteration here with phishing failures in finance. So we should all be aware around the Christmas period in finance, a number of people had, we think, SMS-based attacks against them where their credentials were effectively spoofed or obtained through phishing. And the victims basically ended up giving the attackers just enough information to take over their accounts and siphon money out. In this case, it affected OCBC. It could have been any bank, really, I think. But there's been some interesting aftermath of this. For example, OCBC has paid back the lost money to a number of these people, but then in the press, lawyers and other people have jumped in to say, well, that doesn't set a precedent, right? If you don't look after your accounts properly yourself, don't expect the banks to fix the problem for you by giving you your money back magically. Of course, how customers actually react to that, and if they vote with their feet and their wallets, it will be interesting to see. So really, I've got my eyes on what happens next in the next successful attack against a bank. How do things go down in the public eye? So just 3 examples of what could go wrong from a whole plethora of things. And I think in my mind, there are 3 benefits to having a smart city in a smart world or a smart nation, really, that are also potentially weaknesses. So let me present these ideas to you now. The first is scale. If something is smart, we can usually make it larger, we can make it denser or serve a denser population of people, and we can make it more capable, right? That's usually what we're aiming for when we make something smart. However, by doing that, we've increased the interdependency between all of the components that make up that smart system. And as a result, that system has got a lot more complex as well, and it becomes a lot harder to manage. The next thing we have is connectivity, right? I mentioned that specifically earlier. It is the connectivity that enables smart cities. Devices that couldn't previously communicate can now talk to each other, share data, make decisions that make our lives better. However, that connectivity also exposes those assets within a smart city. So a device that was not previously connected to anything and now is suddenly more accessible to an attacker as well. And thirdly, efficiency. And this is a really critical one, right? What happens when we build something smart is we can do more as a result. And then we get used to it. And then at some point, we realize we've adjusted our lives or the way we operate our city in such a way that we can no longer do it the old way, right? If a hospital's IT systems all suddenly stop and nobody can efficiently run from paper anymore, what do we do about it? So reverting to the non-smart method can actually become disastrous as a result of our reliance on these efficiencies. So I'll pass you over to Shazina, because I want her to talk a bit about it from the industry perspective and what kind of Microsec has learned about some of these issues.
One of the things that was obviously a foreseen consequence of having all these devices out in the field monitoring things is that you get lots of data. And so these things are constantly collecting data, eventually amassing huge amounts of it. And then what do you do with it? So that just leads to privacy concerns as well as practical considerations. There's a cost of storage, but storing it also leads to security concerns because you need to securely store it. And with new regulations like the European Union's GDPR, obviously that is a consideration for any entity that might end up collecting data on EU citizens. The second point relates to OT. OT stands for operational technology, which you can think of as all the equipment that normally operate in industrial settings. And these pieces of equipment interface between, I guess, the electrical world and the physical world. And there is a need for these systems to operate smoothly. Often these methods of communicating used by these systems can be very time sensitive, and that might have physical safety consequences. So you've got to efficiently transfer data from the sensors to the processing system, and from that to the actual components of the system that physically move components. And trying to add traditional cybersecurity mechanisms to these systems is very challenging. So that's the second consideration. The third one refers to SRE, which is a very techy term. It stands for Site Reliability Engineering, and it sort of came about because of the move in IT systems increasingly onto the cloud. So these systems are no longer within, I guess, your physical control in your data center. But IoT faces similar sorts of concerns because you have these devices out in the field. And these devices are communicating all the time. And at the same time, the data being collected is being used for making decisions, sometimes with huge safety consequences. So your unreliable IoT infrastructure may affect decision-making. So how can we be secure in the knowledge that decisions are being made on the basis of robust information, especially given the challenges of such devices operating at the lower level? The last point talks about achieving visibility in growing IoT networks. The problem here essentially is that because there are so many of these devices, it can be quite a task to actually know what you have in your networks. And that is further complicated by the fact that there are so many different communication protocols being used by these devices. So methods which might be used in a traditional IT network involving some sort of network scanning would be much more complicated to achieve in IoT networks, because traditional IT networks traditionally use things like internet protocol and IP addresses. And there are, I guess, tried and true ways of detecting these devices in the network that aren't quite as, in theory, should be available in the IoT protocol world, but because there are so many of them, it is quite difficult.
I think
Steve next.
Yeah, I think a question I could ask everyone watching right now is, how many devices do you have in your home that could be connected to the internet? You think about that for a few seconds. You might enumerate a few laptops. You might be smart and say, oh, my home router is one as well. And then I'll ask you, does your watch have Wi-Fi? Do you have a robotic vacuum cleaner? Do you have a washing machine that's Wi-Fi enabled? Did you set it up or not? It's still there in your house. You probably underestimate the amount of internet connectable devices in your home by at least 50%, I would say. But it would be interesting if everyone goes home tonight and tries to actually count what's there and do a little audit for themselves. And then if anyone has any interest in their own company and their own site, they might think about the same exercise there and probably have already come to terms with the fact that maybe they don't entirely know everything that could be connected to the internet that is sitting around on their sites. So yeah, these are kind of our views on some of the challenges. It's not, it doesn't include everything, but they're the things I think that interest Shazina at Microsec and some of the things on my side here at JCU as well. So what I want to talk about now is what kind of research interests that turns into and what potential collaboration opportunities that creates as well, both in terms of for me and Shazina, but also kind of as an open-ended thing with potentially anybody who's interested in working with JCU on this kind of thing. So the first of the challenges I am particularly interested in is authentication and doing it better. Authentication is proving who you are to somebody or something and establishing what you are allowed to do, having proven that, right? It's identification and then authentication. And I've got 4 areas that I think we need to focus on. Again, not the only 4, but I think these are lower hanging fruit, perhaps, in terms of what we can do better on. The first is protocols for authentication. Now, if you're not familiar with internet security, cybersecurity, don't worry. You will be familiar with at least one of these protocols already, probably, and that is SingPass, or I should say SingPass is an application that provides an authentication protocol. If you live in the smart city of Singapore, you probably log into a lot of government services and maybe other financial services with SingPass. There are other underlying protocols for authentication like FIDO, OpenAuth, and Scram. But here's the thing, when we're on the internet, a lot of the time, we still use an authentication technology called BASIC. And as you might guess, BASIC is not very good. Now, my belief when I was writing this is that a lot of websites and services still somewhat rely on this very basic insecure authentication mechanism. But I couldn't actually find an up-to-date citation I could give you that actually corroborates that. So I don't know, I think I need to work with one of the authentication companies in some sort of market survey to establish how big that hole is right now. So yeah, I'm very interested to find out about that. But you know, we have better technology and we're not using it. So why and how do we transition is the question I'm asking there. The second is factors. We may have heard about authentication factors. In cybersecurity, we often think about it in terms of 3 possible ways of proving who we are. Something I know, something I am, and something I have. And in terms of something I am, it would be something I cannot change about myself, like my fingerprint on my iris. And I think generally we perceive that things like fingerprint-based authentication, to say get into our phone, is quite safe, is quite robust. But biometrics can actually be more vulnerable than passwords, right? If someone steals my fingerprint, I can't replace my fingerprint. All I can do is chop my finger off and use some more. And I have, 10 attempts at changing that, right, before I run out of options or I start using my toes. Another element is something we call multi-factor authentication. We've all seen it, we all do it. We log into our bank or wherever, and they say, oh, we sent you an SMS, type this in as well, in order to prove who you are and that you're in possession of the right devices. Or you have a token, or you have an app that prompts you to press a button, or so on. Problem is, this is, as far as I'm concerned, a bit of a mess right now. I wrote a blog piece about that just last month, so at the end you can see a link to that. We can do a lot better with that than we are now. And in fact, getting this wrong is what caused a lot of the issues with the OCBC phishing situation. And we've seen a lot of banks since then scrambling to address that hole because that really kind of brought those vulnerabilities to light. The third one is a false sense of security. I am sure everybody is at least aware of a green padlock hovering around in their browser. Now, I would imagine most of you think, padlock, great, everything's secure. It means I'm using SSL or TLS. I may have heard of that, so I know I'm in good hands when this is visible. However, what that actually means, if it's not done properly, is that you're now securely communicating with whoever's on the other end of it. And you might not have properly verified who that is. You could be securely communicating with an attacker, with a thief who is stealing your data. What does that mean? It means, well, no one else can steal your data except for that particular thief, but you didn't want that thief to steal your data either. So yeah, unfortunately, the ability to stick a padlock on a website, to kind of put it in crude terms, creates a false sense of security. And we don't do enough to verify that this is done more robustly. And the third area I'm interested in is physical processes that kind of underpin some of these other points. When we're logging into things, when we're accessing things, we click and we tap. We don't think, right? We get used to a confirmation box. We get used to clicking on continue, log in, yes, skip, whatever, right? We're used to filtering out what we see as not useful information and stuff that's routine. And that can cause problems, right? If we think we're logging into our banking app, if we think we're talking to our robot vacuum cleaner or whatever, we just click everything we expect to come up. And if it's not actually what we're supposed to be talking to, we could be interacting with something improperly without even realizing. Or when we do realize, we've already clicked the yes button and it's already too late. Something bad is set in motion. And an area that interests me is how to kind of make people physically interact better with security processes without getting in the way too much. And an idea that I'm looking at here is the concept of point and call, which is something that is used in the Japan rail system, for one example, where the train operators actually point at everything they are interacting with or checking. So there's a green light. This switch is set to on. This lever is set to here. Every time they're doing a check or making a change. And that physical interaction, sorry, I nearly accidentally pointed you through the screen there. It kind of reinforces the process, and it kind of prevents or tries to reduce the likelihood that you skip or overlook certain things. And that, I think, is something that could be better worked into how we live our lives online and in smart cities as well. So the next area is misbehaving IoT devices. Let's talk about the Internet of Things. Smart devices with users who aren't entirely sure how risky it is to be interacting with them. So let's talk about humans and let's talk about IoT. Here's a few examples. Right? Here's a smart door lock. It's got a fingerprint reader. Here's a smart lamp with color controls, and presumably you can turn it on and off from inside or outside of your home. And here's a vacuum cleaner. What I love about modern vacuum cleaners is they have a little LiDAR, like a light radar on top. And when they're going around vacuuming, they're basically constantly taking an image of your house to some degree. So yeah, just be mindful of that while these things are roaming around your house and whatever else you're doing at the time. Is a lack of understanding what these devices can do, exposing users to IT risks. Now, obviously, I'm putting this question forward in a rhetorical sense because I think yes. How do we know if an IoT device is genuine, is trustworthy, or is actually compromised or not? And really, who cares? The reason we should care about this is that these targets are often easier to get into, but they're not the final destination that an attacker wants to get into. They're used for something called lateral movement. If I can hack your washing machine, or if I can hack your door lock, or if I can hack your robotic vacuum cleaner, I can then sit on your home network and wait for an opportunity to hack any other device that is on it. And that other device could be your phone, it could be your router, it could be your laptop, and that might be where I can get a lot more juicy stuff, right? And I could sit there for a long time in that compromised device, and it'd still work even, and you'd never know that I'm just waiting for the opportunity to pounce. And yeah, we don't worry about that enough, and I don't think we build systems well enough to cater to this problem. And this is well underappreciated by device owners, so people aren't demanding it of their devices, that they prove that they are safe. And that really comes into enterprise home security, right? A lot of the technologies that we could use are there, but we don't use them in the home. And I ask you, why not? Really, I'm putting forward the case for a concept called zero trust, but in the home. Now, zero trust is something that is becoming more popular and increasingly adopted within enterprises. The idea that just because you're inside a corporate network, for example, doesn't mean every device on that corporate network is vetted and trusted. You assume nothing is trustworthy until you've directly proven with each other that you can be trusted and some kind of secure exchange takes place. That's the principle of zero trust, really. With things like work from home, bring your own device, and the number of IoT devices increasing in enterprises, companies have tried to deal with this concept. And there are approaches for dealing with this thing in kind of a work from home, connecting to the cloud concept. There's a citation later for you to look at that if you're interested. But home networks are still very flat and trusting, right? You have one Wi-Fi password, everything joins it. And even if your router supports multiple Wi-Fi IDs, I don't think many people ever really set that up. But as I said previously, the weakest device could be compromised and be the place from which lateral movement then occurs. And if your devices all trust each other, that's going to be bad news. So the technology is there and the know-how is there. We don't see it in the consumer space yet. And I think that affects a big slice of smart cities when the end user, the consumer, can be adversely affected by these things. And the next one is something that's kind of, again, based off that previous idea of trustworthy devices. And that is the software that's kind of baked into these devices, which we often call the firmware. How do we make sure those are kept secure and safe so that an attacker, like evil version of me, can't come in and modify it and then sit to wait to siphon out your bank account or do something else like that? So again, the technology is there. There are technologies called public key infrastructure. That's basically how SSL works for accessing websites. There's firmware signing, which basically says, I prove that the software that I'm giving to this device is legitimate. So if you're updating your device, you know you're updating it with trustworthy software from the trusted manufacturer. There's processes like secure boots. This happens in laptops, it happens in phones, it's happening increasingly in IoT devices, but not enough. Basically proving that nothing has been tampered with when the device starts up, so it knows it can do its thing safely. And another technology that sits underneath that is called a trusted platform module. If you've installed Windows 11, you may be aware that that's now a requirement for you to have that in there on your laptop. Again, something that's often missing from IoT devices though. But the tools and best practices aren't always there. When it comes to consumer devices, especially the management platforms out there, I dare say in a lot of smart city infrastructure, the management platforms can be a bit chaotic as well. The processes for commissioning devices, right? If I receive a shipment of devices or I buy a device off the shelf, how do I safely add it to my network, to my platform, to my ecosystem, to my city? How do I monitor it once it's set up? And if I do sense a problem of some kind, how do I respond to that? What should be the process? A lot of the time, these things get left behind and very quickly we forget about everything until we realize something has gone horribly wrong. Now, there are industry standards that make recommendations like the NIST cybersecurity framework, IEC 62443 for industrial automation, GRC and COBIT, others that cover various angles on some of these processes and regulations. But what home user would care about any of these? What we need is providers of these devices to build systems that just make it seamless for these things to be followed and done and observed. And I think we have an opportunity in academia and industry to really figure out how to get there when it comes to general public interacting with devices like this, directly or indirectly. So then we ask the questions, is my device secure? Are my behaviors normal? Who is verifying all of this? Like, who do I trust? And do I trust them to tell me everything is okay? And what happens when things go wrong? So this, I think, Shazina is going to use this as an opportunity to talk about it from Microsec's perspective on what it means for creating a secure IoT device.
Many of the points which Steve mentioned in the previous slide are considerations, obviously, in IoT. And the first of those is firmware and package signing. And like all devices these days are getting increasingly complex. So the main idea is to secure the device from the start when it's being designed through to any software that might be loaded onto it during its lifetime, through to the securing the communications and the data being exchanged between the device and its environment, all the way through to eventually decommissioning it. And in terms of firmware and package signing, firmware refers to the software that's put on the device at the time of manufacture and can't be changed. And packages refer to the software that can be downloaded to the device over the course of its lifetime. And one scalable way of securing it is using this technology, which Steve mentioned earlier, called the public key infrastructure, or PKI. The idea is very similar to how TLS works on the internet. So if you're browsing the internet, the website that you're browsing to should have its own certificate, and that certificate proves the identity of the owner of the website. And in an IoT network, the same idea would apply, so that any trusted entity has its own certificate, and the certificate contains the public key, and the entity keeps the private key safe. And the public key and private key are mathematically related, so that you can derive the public key from the private key, but not the other way around. And with the private key, you're able to basically ensure that you can sign the software, so that the end users of the software can verify the signature, your signature, using the public key. And the second component refers to package repository management. That really refers to the idea that any person or entity who is in control of the repository where packages are stored should themselves also be trusted within this network. And the PKI applies in a similar sense. And the next consideration that comes up is some way to manage all the keys that belong to the trusted entities within this network. And there are several mechanisms in place to do this. On a device-by-device basis, there is the Trusted Platform module, which Steve mentioned earlier. And there are other ways that, there are other methods that can be used. They're not, unfortunately, many of these tools are not really accessible for a layperson to use. And the fourth component refers to package management. That refers to, for instance, if the packages that you want your device to download over the course of its lifetime are available publicly, you might want some way to track known vulnerabilities for this package. And you do it using this this list called Common Vulnerabilities and Exposures. That is the CVE in the on the picture, and it's basically an open database that is updated over time with pieces of software that are publicly in use, and it keeps track of bugs that people report publicly. And by keeping track of these vulnerabilities, you can receive alerts from, you can subscribe to alerts from this service, and they'll let you know if a software version that you have in use in your organization is vulnerable, so you can just know to update it the next time around as soon as possible. The fifth component refers to anomaly detection. That refers to anything that you might do to monitor the device behavior to see if anything is out of the ordinary. And like most areas of life these days, it's quite trendy to throw a bunch of AI at it, or machine learning, that sort of thing. The next component is encryption of the communications. Steve and I mentioned earlier about the use of TLS over the internet, that we often notice it as the padlocks when we browse. And TLS, I guess, traditionally operates mostly in a traditional IT setting where devices have IP addresses. And it is often really difficult to apply this wholesale to other non-IP communication protocols. But it is possible, and we'll talk about it later on. Moving on to Steve.
Okay, thanks, Shaz. So we've kind of concerned ourselves with securing IoT devices. So let's get into another more specific example. I can actually talk about some of the research that's actively going on here at JCU as well. In preventative medicine, let's think about what healthcare IoT devices might do. they can increase our opportunities for preventative medicine, right? Closer monitoring of chronic or age-related diseases. This is known, so this is a good motivation. And if we can do that well, we actually reduce load on hospitals because we have more efficient system. We catch problems earlier. People end up less sick, or if they need treatment, they don't need it in a hospital. They can be an outpatient, for example, or the scheduling can be more flexible. But we've seen in the past 2 years, right, how sensitive hospitals are to overloading. That's not a Singapore-specific problem. That's an issue pretty much the world over. And so we need to leverage this HIoT idea without introducing significant new risks to patients or the healthcare system, right? Not risks to data, not risks to, we make it so efficient, we then, if that efficiency goes away, have our healthcare system grind to a halt, right? Just like the NHS example I gave towards the beginning of the presentation. We've got to be really careful about this sort of thing. Some of the challenges around that: how do we keep this personal health-related data confidential? Do we know and how do we manage who has access to this stuff? Who's in charge of looking after it? And who actually decides who should have access to these things? There's other data lifecycle related stuff we could consider here as well, but I won't talk about that now. The next is integrity, right? If I have, in a sense of healthcare IoT, I might have a device that, let's take my wristwatch, right? That's monitoring, I don't know, blood oxygen level, heart rate, blood pressure. It could be a whole bunch of things, blood sugar. Which sensor generated this data? Is it good data? Is it bad data? And has it been manipulated, transformed, corrupted, or otherwise its integrity affected between when it was created and since the last time we looked at it, wherever it gets stored? And then finally, availability. This is how is our data actually stored and distributed, made available to whatever needs it, and where is it actually stored? This is a problem for healthcare because it may be that data needs to be stored within the country of origin, right? We have this concept called data sovereignty, right? Governments would prefer certain data to stay within their borders. And that's a very reasonable thing. But once we start putting things into the cloud, which IoT basically almost necessitates, do we still have sufficient control over that we can ensure that kind of thing holds true? And these three things form something that underpins all of cybersecurity as a concept. We often talk about cybersecurity in terms of C, I, and A. That's confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Not the only things we talk about, but these come up quite a lot. So we're actually working now at JCU on this problem in the area of securing, let's say, body-mounted health IoT devices. It's a cross collaboration between Singapore and Australia parts of JCU, right? We have 3 campuses, two countries and 1 university, to use the 3-2-1 that we like to. We are trying to leverage blockchain technology, which I'm sure everyone's heard about and maybe got excited about at some point, for securing healthcare IoT data. Currently, this is in the first stage of research, so there's not a lot that I could talk about right now on it, but there are future phases planned for this research that will require collaboration with both cybersecurity entities as well as healthcare entities as well. I'm working on that with Dr. Jusak here in Singapore and Dr. Kevin in Australia. They're experts in communications and IoT. In terms of solutions for that, right, how we can actually leverage that, well, as it happened, as this project kicked off and I was talking to Shaz, there were some potential opportunities there that we can start talking about. So I'll give her a chance to talk about those now.
In chatting with Steve about this, I guess, new project, there are several areas where we could see that Microsec could help. In terms of PKI for IoT devices, you would need some way to verify, to make sure that the devices are indeed allowed on the ecosystem that you're trying to protect. And PKI is really, I guess, the most scalable way of doing it. And I mentioned this earlier, key management, just because that there are so many devices and the devices might not be very high powered. Any solution that is embedded into the device to protect the keys would have to operate within the constraints of the device. The third component is device management. So this refers to, I guess, how over the life cycle of the device, you might want to retire it from the ecosystem or make sure that its certificate is updated. This is something we've had some experience with in the past. And obviously with 4, we've had experience working with these tiny devices. So we are aware of the constraints placed on these devices and are well placed to give advice on how best to proceed. With item 5, device detection, this refers more to monitoring the network to detect which devices are part of the network. So if the healthcare IoT project does involve some sort of network at some point in the future, that is something that Microsec would be able to assist with.
So that's a conversation that's ongoing, I would say. We're not sure exactly what direction that will go in yet because the project itself has only recently kicked off. But I think it's important to talk about these things now so that companies like Microsec, any other entities can also be talking with us about how we can help each other out, essentially. Okay, so as I look at the time, we shall wrap up shortly and go to the Q&A. So let us conclude with a few final thoughts. So what can we do to address some of these problems? Well, I think my message is that collaboration is really important. And as I already see in some of the questions coming up, multidisciplinary issues are really important to consider, right? It's not just an IT problem, it's not just a tech problem, it's not just maths, it's physical world, it's human behavior, it's a whole number of things. It's also policy, governance, a whole swathe of things. So we need industry, government, and academic effort to improve the state of the art. Innovation from any one of these 3 areas won't go very far if the others don't help push it along as well. Another element is community, right? We need an ecosystem of people and organizations all pushing in that same direction. We need to organize ourselves to participate and grow those relationships, ideas. We can't solve these problems in silos. So while this talk may have baffled some of you or inspired some of you, hopefully what comes out of it is a conversation that we can use to learn more from each other and use that to figure out what we can do next. And of course, the obvious one is, these things don't come for free, right? We need funding. But there are all manner of schemes across these disciplines from government, private, public sources that we can use to help make a case and secure the funding to forward some of these issues and solve some of them, or at least make the situation less dire than I painted it at the beginning of the talk. I think a good example of this is what a company like Microsec has done previously, because they do collaborate and research with others. So and now I'll just let Shaz briefly talk about what they've done in the past to give you an idea of, companies can do this.
On the slide, there are a couple of projects which I've mentioned, and we've previously done work with SUTD and ADSC, so it is possible, we're legitimate, and we're good to work with. So in the first case, we have a smart lighting project, and that involved using a proprietary method to encrypt the communications between the lampposts, which were in a sort of mesh network, and the communications from lampposts to the gateway and the gateway to the backend systems. And the encryption aimed to protect the control operation signals which were being sent, essentially to turn the lights on and off. And I guess the obvious reason why you want to protect this is that you don't want someone else kind of just injecting these signals and kind of turning the signals for a city on and off as they wish. And the other component of this project was that we were able to prove that by issuing each of the lampposts and nodes on this network a certificate, prove that they are allowed within this ecosystem, and also to ensure that is the entity actually that is actually sending the control signals over allowed to do so? The second project we worked on was in the area of power grid and industrial control systems. That had to do with monitoring the network of these systems to produce a map of the devices on the network, as well as monitoring the network traffic to detect any unusual behavior on any of the devices. And on this project, we were able to visualize where in the network such anomalies took place. So we were excited to work on similar projects in the future, and hopefully in the future we'll get to work with Steve more.
Thanks, Shaz. That's nice. I think one of the struggles about this is sometimes you can't talk about the projects you work on to much of a degree because they're sometimes on really important secret things. So that's a challenge. But yeah, they do go work on these things. Interestingly, the two are related, right? If you have control over too many electrical devices, too many lights, too many air conditioners, and you can turn them all on and off at the same time, that could be bad news for your power grid. Right, there's a unique problem in the UK where after football matches, everybody goes and turns the kettle on to make a cup of tea. And the national grid in the UK has to account for that and know when the halftime break in a football match will be in order to ramp up power production to avoid their grid browning out, because the Brits sure do love their cups of tea. Okay, so that concludes our talk today. I'll just leave this slide with references up for a minute while I thank you all for listening. I see a few questions have come in. If you have any more, then just feel free to add them in, and we'll start answering them in a second. Otherwise, let me show you some contact details if you want to get hold of either of us for any reason, right? If you're interested in Microsec and what they do, you can talk to Shazina. She'll connect you with the right people. And that's my email address there if you're interested in what JCU or myself is up to. Okay, thanks everyone. I'll pass back to Roberto for a moment.
Okay, well, thank you, Steve and Shazina. It's really a very compelling and interesting talk. So extremely interesting. And I see we have quite a few questions from the audience as well. So first, yeah, Denise is asking, first question, yes, the matter of data overload has encroached onto personal practices. Gmail used to actively encourage users to retain all emails, no need to delete. Whereas now we are getting messages about storage reaching capacities. So much data being uploaded globally. Is there a peak capacity or tipping point at which time there will simply be no way back? What do you think?
This one I see maybe a bit differently to some other challenges with data. I think the reason that the Gmail situation is the way it is that at one point it was useful for Google to have as much data about you as possible so that they could use that to sell you things through ads, right? But now they can get money out of you by forcing you to pay for storage. That's more valuable than infinite emails are to them, especially with an increase in regulations around what you can do with a user's data. So maybe they can get less out of your data now, and as a result, that means you have to start paying for it. That's how I see it. I don't know if Shaz, you have a different opinion on that specific situation.
I guess the last part of the question interested me. I don't think there will be a way back to the time before all these massive tech firms have little to no information on us. It's not how the world works. I am actually personally in my tech life, I take as much measures as possible to stay off the grid. I'm one of those people who, I'm not a tech enthusiast. I don't have any smart devices in my home, and I'm stealing this from a Twitter user. He said that tech enthusiasts get excited about every little thing, but people who actually work in tech keep a gun by their printer in case it starts making strange noises so they can shoot it. And I found out about that tweet from Steve. So yeah, I don't think the world will go back to us being able to, you know, stay anonymous. Yeah, so
there's no way back already.
So there is no way back, yes.
Okay, great. That's probably not great news for Denise, but
Okay, another interesting question from an attendee, whether we should be concerned about AI learning to hack our devices or bypass security protocol, and if so, what we can do to mitigate this?
That's a very interesting question. One of the subjects I teach on the Bachelor of Cybersecurity program is ethical hacking. Give students a taste of that. What I don't teach there is kind of really nitty-gritty hacking methods, just sort of initial approaches and stuff. But of course, there are already tools and technologies for automating hacking of systems and learning what works and what doesn't. So should we be concerned? Well, yes, and we already are. And what can we do to mitigate it? Well, all of our existing cybersecurity approaches deal with it to some degree. It's the same problem. It's that we are always on the back foot as a defender. The attacker has to get something right once. We have to get it right all of the time. And one of the best defenses we have is something called defense in depth, where we have multiple layers to our security, such that if one of them doesn't hold up, there are others that will catch the problem on the way before the attacker gets to the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow or whatever it is that they're looking for.
Okay, another question from Denise about the human factor. So yeah, the human factor seems to predominate in cybersecurity threats or glitches. It seems a lot of what you are suggesting concerns ways to overcome human vulnerabilities. I wonder if it will ever be possible to find workarounds to accommodate humanness. So that's another, yeah, quite interesting point. So what are your views on this?
Shaz, do you have any view on that?
I think we can look to the recent past with the aviation industry, for instance, and motor cars. With I guess it's the smart home devices that proliferate at the moment, there is little to no regulation about them and on the safety requirements that they must meet. And in contrast, in aviation, it's a very, very regulated industry, and that is why, in terms of how cybersecurity concerns should be taken into place, I really think that these traditionally high-risk engineering industries are the best place to look in terms of best practices for manufacturing connected devices in the future. And I think we're at the stage now where I guess the market has just kind of rushed out to meet the demand for these devices without actually having to meet the safety requirements just because nobody thought that the safety requirements would be needed. So, and with the aviation industry, they came up, one of the things they do is come up with checklists. So, you know, if when the pilot gets into the cockpit, they have to, there's a checklist for every single thing, because, you know, if you're in an emergency situation, you kind of get, most of us, it's very human to just have your mind go blank, and a checklist can be very useful to help you figure things out in those situations. So that is how the aviation industry has dealt with the human factor. So I think those ideas could be very useful in IoT.
And I think I mentioned earlier my interest in the concept of like pointing at things and other physical interactions that kind of reinforce what's going on. Yeah, that doesn't come in so much in aviation, but that came in trains in Japan. That's another interesting thing. But yeah, I completely agree with what Shazina said there.
Next question, if you can elaborate more about transport layer security and how it's usually not used for non-IP communications, and how can TLS be used in IoT security?
I suppose the very quick answer to that, because we could talk all day about TLS, right? Either myself or Shazina. It was built for IP networks. It was built for communication where delivery of messages is guaranteed. And those two properties do not always exist in an IoT device. Now, there are variants of TLS, for example, DTLS, which is designed to enable it to work over those other kinds of networks with those other kinds of devices. But TLS is actually still quite big. If you have very small, very low power devices, it can be hard to get them to fit. And I'll let Shaz talk about like why Microsec specializes in that kind of thing. But basically their interest is in that area where doing things where TLS doesn't fit, right?
So this is, I guess, the reason why Microsec exists. The founders came up with this protocol to, I guess, provide devices which aren't capable of TLS and ability to communicate using a protocol that uses the principles of TLS. So they're not directly interoperable, but I guess the principles are broadly the same. So in one, Steve briefly mentioned that TLS is rather big, and I'll just mention the certificates which are used by your average website, for instance. These operate using a format called X.509, and each certificate is several kilobytes in size. And at the start of every, I guess, TLS connection, if the two devices at each endpoint have a certificate, then they must transmit the certificates to each other. That means an exchange of maybe over 10 kilobytes at the start of the communication. If you have an IoT protocol that doesn't allow you to send, unlimited amounts of data at one time, some of the protocols are restricted to, maybe 20 bytes at a time. You can see how using TLS would be not workable in that situation. So one of the things that Microsec has done is keep the, I guess, boil down the certificate to its mathematical essence, what is needed for the cryptography to work, and then just omit everything else that is part of your average, I guess, X.509 certificate. On the internet, it's possible to kind of look at the certificate and all the information that's in it. That is not what you would need in an IoT network because it's a closed ecosystem. So the certificate format is slightly different.
Next question is, please share more about industrial IoT and what specific threats are there and that are unique to IoT.
Industrial IoT brings all the flexibility of Internet of Things and all the vulnerabilities of Internet of Things into a world where if things go wrong, people die or things go on fire. That's it really, right? In industrial IoT is much more closely connected to operational technology. And then as Shaz was saying, it's about things that are time sensitive or safety critical can be involved. If it's not safety critical, it could still result in entire batches of products being lost because a device was misbehaving or malfunctioning. Think about it, if something happens in your home to a device, it's inconvenient for you. If something happens in a factory or at a power plant or in a train station, it can cost millions of dollars in a very short space of time. This is the problem with IoT. And yet, if you get it right, you can save millions of dollars. That's the trade-off we're trying to deal with.
Next question is still a bit related to this. So could you elaborate more about Wi-Fi risks in IoT security and whether Wi-Fi could be an area of vulnerability for IoT devices as well? So what would be a good solution eventually?
I think that probably is a question that warrants a longer answer. I feel like writing a blog post about it now. But what I would say then is I'd invite you, reach out to myself or Shaz by email or find us on LinkedIn. We can talk a bit more about that. IoT devices that connect over Wi-Fi are definitely more vulnerable. We've seen lots of examples of that previously. So I can share some of those with you perhaps offline. Thanks for asking.
Yeah, so the next question is also quite interesting. It's about how often do attacks happen because of explicit human error compared to some intrinsic weakness in the technology. So every time we hear the news, in fact, actually, it always seems that there is some basic human mistakes that people do that enables the attack. So is this really the main reason? Yeah. Is really the main trigger for a successful attack?
Who should we blame, Shazina? Should we blame people or technology? What do you think?
I think both. I mean, for instance, sometimes it's not explicit human error. Sometimes it's just leaving systems unupdated for a very, very long time, which is what happened with the NHS. So for instance, with the WannaCry attacks, I guess it was that and some of the ransomware attacks were probably targeted at very specific targets, but just because there are so many out-of-date systems around, they just ended up being taken down as well.
I think cybersecurity experts have a big problem with communication with others, right? We understand our technologies, we know how to make things secure, but we often forget that people are the ones that get to decide whether that security holds up or not. You know, there was probably someone in the NHS shouting about this risk that existed, but they didn't know how to communicate it in such a way that the decision makers would take it seriously enough. Or maybe a decision was made that that was an acceptable risk, but perhaps it was the wrong decision. This is something that goes on in business and organizations all the time. And yeah, humans will always be in some way involved in this, even the more and more automated and the more artificial intelligence is involved in all of the rest of it. So the good news is that means that there's always a human opportunity to improve something, to fix something, or to catch a problem.
I think at a wider, I guess, business level as well, cybersecurity is a cost center. It is, for many businesses, it's not how they make their money. So it's a business decision. Do you want to spend money on cybersecurity before the risk has materialized, or, you know, kind of wait until something jumps in your face and then you decide that you should do something about it?
Then we have one more question from Robert Burke that essentially asks whether there is a tendency from large parts of the population to ignore the risk and not to worry too much about privacy. So as he's concerned about security and privacy, however, it seems that many people don't. So does this have an impact on the research or on the uptake of the research in your view?
I think we've certainly normalized caring a lot less about these things, right? Most people have a Facebook. Many people have a TikTok. Many people use Twitter. They volunteer so much information about themselves that, yeah, legislation is lagging behind in that regard. And in fact, the moment legislation tries to help, for example, when Europe imposed rules about how browsers or websites should issue cookies to store bits of information about visitors to websites, the end result was websites getting a lot more inconvenient to use as we get pop-ups requesting the ability to use cookies. And we're like, oh, yes, just go away. And it gets back to that problem I was talking about earlier. It was just taking the path of least resistance. And yeah, I think the question should be to what extent does the public need to concern itself with it? And should we actually be asking the creators of devices and the people that manage systems to assemble them and run them in such a way that people will naturally do the safety-minded or security-minded thing? The easier you make it to do things securely, the more likely it is people will do it. The moment it gets in the way, the user will see a desire path or create a desire path that goes around it. And that has always been one of the biggest challenges for me in security, is how to do it and make it so that people will actually want to use it.
Okay, I also have a question, something that I was thinking lately, because yeah, in these days we really saw a lot of concern about adopting using technology that originated in different countries and different nation states, and governments and agencies seems like they're fearing that products by foreign companies may actually be used in future, at least have the potential to be used as Trojan horses for malware or spying activities and so on. So do you think this could also be a real concern that can potentially affect a highly technological, hyper-connected smart city with everything that we are putting online and so on? So do you think that a country should just really try to use only homemade tech, or can we trust others? I don't think even it's possible just to use homemade technology. So in a way, yeah, is this a real threat, or we're just being a bit paranoid on these matters?
Shaz, what do you think? How do you trust everything you buy and everything you put in your system?
It is very difficult. I mean, the supply chain involved in making one tiny little gadget is hideously complicated. So I guess from the perspective of a government, I guess one idea that's existed in the open source software community for a very long time is that the fact that something has its source code public means that a lot more eyes are on it. So, problems like this can be detected. So that is a theoretical benefit of, say, a public service potentially moving on into using things like open source software. And yeah, but otherwise, yeah, that's the only idea.
I really agree. I think that probably the key is using open source software that in a way we can trust what we see, but we cannot really trust.
I guess the downside of using open source software is that it has the image of being much less user friendly. And I can attest, for instance, that I try to make anything Bluetooth work with my Linux and it simply does not work. It's a complete nightmare. So yeah, there are trade-offs with that, obviously. But I guess the main point is that the supply chain of anything is hideously complicated. So I guess there are ways to get around it, but nothing is perfect. So like Steve said, defense in depth and, try and avoid storing too much data for a very long time and yeah, use the carrier pigeon, I don't know, then flushing the notes down the toilet.
I like open source. I contribute to some open source projects and I think it's a great solution. And I think the amount of scrutiny it gets is a good thing. I don't think it's necessary for everything, but everything that you want to use at scale should be subject to some kind of scrutiny, even if not by everybody, but by those interested parties. And, we need to everybody needs to follow processes that are already defined in how to securely build software and systems and prove it to the person you're selling it to. And build this, like Shaz said, this supply chain, right? We're becoming more interested in supply chains in general as people, right? We care about where our products are sourced from, all of the components that are in them, what happens when we send them away to get recycled. We're all starting to think about these things now. And those physical aspects are just as true when you translate them into digital concepts. Everything that goes into these devices that are propping up a smart city, where's it all come from? How are they made? Who's checked that everything is done properly, and what do we do if there is an issue? Again, it can be done. I just think maybe we haven't emphasized enough the importance of doing so and got enough good examples of it being done successfully for people to follow suit.
See, there is one more question. So there's been some talk of a cyber pandemic, so some huge scale national level attacks and many critical operations being shut down at the same time and so on. So how realistic could something like this be? So really a large scale attack that shuts down a city?
I mean, depends what you mean by shuts down a city, right? You only need one train fault to ruin transportation in a big city for hours, right? So if I presume you mean something more severe, like several days of disruption to all kinds of systems. And I would like to think that, in OT, even without connectivity, operational technologists have figured out how to build large systems that avoid single points of failure and cascading failures. But it does still happen. I mean, I watched a fantastic YouTube video just a few weeks ago about the collapse of the power grid in the northeast of the United States and Canada about 10, 15 years ago, and the circumstances that led to that. And it was all caused by one IT alert system not letting people know that something was broken. And the end result was hours of no power in New York and other cities. So could it happen again? Yes. Will it happen again? Almost certainly yes. I would like to think that some places are better equipped to deal with it than others, and will limit the scope of impact. And I very much hope that that will be true of somewhere like here. But really, I guess we'll just have to see, won't we?
Not even talking about things from a cyber perspective. My brother's a risk engineer, and you know, we were chatting about things, and he said the amount of work that he would classify as being, you know, fairly important to get done soon, so that the system keeps going, that doesn't get done. There's that, and then you factor in the cyber element of it. Then yeah, it's. I try not to think about it. It keeps Steve up at night, and I try not to think about it.
Okay, great. So I guess, is there any other question? Anything else anyone in the audience wants to discuss?
If anyone has any follow-up, they want to get in touch with any of us, please go ahead. I'm sure you can find us. I know Shaz, she's kind of off-grid, but you know her name. You can find her. Okay, then thank you very much, all of you, for participating, and of course for our speakers today, Steve and Shazina. So thank you very much for joining us. It was really a very, very interesting and really useful session, I think, for all of us. So see you next time. Thanks. Bye.